The mark was so thin you could have missed it 5 words scratched into wind-burned granite, a few feet above a melting lip of old ice. I brushed away grit with my glove and felt the letters with 2 fingertips, the way you do a name on a headstone when you're not ready to say it out loud. The alpine air smelled like pennies and snowmelt. The words held their own weather. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from in the comments and hit like and subscribe if you believe some names should never fade. I've lived most of my life in the same small rectangle of Montana, the kind of place where the morning sounds are dependable. A pickup easing down the street at 6 a.m., the low horn of a freight out near the river cut, and magpies arguing over nothing in particular. Columbia Falls has always been a town that carries its chores in quiet. In July, the daylight runs long and folks leave their windows open for the breeze that comes off the high country. On those warm evenings, the smell of fresh-cut grass rides the air as surely as the sound of aluminum screen doors catching and releasing. Back then, I worked out the end of my ranger years at the west side of Glacier, mostly admin and safety talks with the occasional trail patrol when we were short-handed. I still kept my old habits: coffee before dawn from the gas station on Nucleus Avenue, then a slow drive past the high school and out toward the peaks just to look. If the sun hit the divide clean and the cloud base sat high, I'd stand in the lot by the flag and listen to the quiet. Mountain quiet isn't empty. It has a pulse. You learn to hear if anything is off. That summer felt ordinary in the best way. The park shuttles ran full to Logan Pass by mid-morning, and by evening they came back with the same sunburned faces, the same jokes about mountain goats and thin air. We'd hang laminated "Know Before You Go" cards on the placards by the trailheads, watch folks glance at them, nod, and keep moving. You learn not to take offense. A good day to me is when the radio stays boring and the last shuttle rounds the corner with all its seats accounted for. The Wyatts lived 2 turns and a short gravel lane from my place. If you walked past after supper, you'd hear a handplane singing in David's garage, see curls of pine piling onto the floor while he shaped a table leg or fixed whatever needed fixing for the church auction. He'd look up through his readers and wave with the tool still in his hand. Mary Ellen kept the porch light low even in summer, a habit she said she picked up when the boys were little. Warm glow, not a beacon, just enough to say someone's awake if you need us. Luke was the quiet one. Not shy, not sullen quiet, like a library you're glad to enter. He wore his pack high and snug the way I tell kids to, and he checked straps twice. He didn't load up on gadgets. He stuck to the small things that matter when the temperature swings 40 degrees in a day: a real whistle, a folded map, a square of orange cloth that could serve 5 purposes if you know how to use it. Sometimes he'd stop by my truck after a safety talk and ask a single question, never more. How long does packed snow keep its edge? How low will the wind chill fall if the forecast misses by 10 degrees? He had a way of listening that made you want to answer well. Jonah had more volume to him, the cheerful kind. I taught both boys blood stop and blister care at a youth clinic in the fire hall one February when the roads were glassy and the coffee tasted like burnt toast. Jonah cracked steady jokes about my old-timer stories. Luke folded gauze and watched my hands. 2 years apart, 2 different speeds under the same name. I remember that like I remember the lines on my own palm. On Saturday mornings, if I wasn't on schedule, I'd catch Mary Ellen at the grocery when she stocked up on lunch meat and fruit for the week. We'd talk about the same things folks do in a town that means to keep itself small potholes. The county still hadn't filled the older couple down on 8th Street who needed a ramp. How early the choke cherries came on that year. If the conversation lingered, she'd tilt her head toward the hills and ask almost as a confession how the snow looked up high. I'd give the honest answer because that's all a person is owed in a place that can turn on a gust. That first week of July carried a generous kind of warmth, mid-70s by afternoon, down in town, cool at daybreak, the river moving as if it didn't mind us watching. We posted the usual warnings about runoff and thin snow bridges above 7,500 feet. The forecast was steady. The radios were quiet. I tuned my ears to other things, the clack of hiking poles tapping asphalt near the shuttle stop, the buzz of a saw biting soft pine in David's garage, the whir of sprinklers turning lawns to jeweled nets at dusk. On a Tuesday evening, I ran into Luke outside the gear shop. He had a topo folded to a square and a pencil laid along one margin. He didn't ask where to go. Boys like him never do. He asked how to come back if thin cloud after lunch meant colder air would settle early if the wind that rattled the lodgepole near the overlook would stick or slide. I told him what I knew and what I didn't. He nodded and smiled a little the way a person does when they're tucking a detail away for later. He bought a bar of dark chocolate and a fresh set of boot laces. I remember because he joked very quietly about buying laces like buying a spare belt before you need one. It made me laugh. He thanked me, and that was that. In small towns, there's a rhythm to departure. Folks call when they're on the way out, text when they make the canyon blow the horn once, when they ease back in. The Wyatts were no different. If a light stayed on late, it usually meant someone's canner was going, or a ball game ran to extra innings. If a porch went dark before 9, it meant the early shift. We read one another by glow and by silence. That's how places like ours hold together. A few evenings later, I ran the park road up to the pass in my personal rig just to stretch the dust out. I pulled at a turnout and watched the high clouds slide past the ridge like slow cattle. You can stand there and feel the country breathing even with tourists a parking lot over trying to take a photo without someone else's elbow in it. The air thins quick above 8,000 feet. It sharpens the world so that every edge looks a little too clean. I stayed until the first real chill pushed me back into the truck, then drove home with the windows down and the heater on a Montana Compromise. The day after that, the town ran on rails. The bakery sold out of fry bread before noon. The post office line spilled to the door. The church team took the trailer down to the ball field for the car wash fundraiser. David stacked cedar strips in the garage and cut them into curves with a calm hand. That evening, I stood at the edge of my yard and listened to the crickets take over from the robins. I could see the Wyatt porch from my place if I leaned a little past the lilacs. Their light was on the soft yellow they liked. Nothing unusual, nothing at all. I remember a lot of small things from those days. A lawn chair left open in the yard behind the corner house. A dog bowl under the spigot half full of hose water waiting for a thirsty Labrador. A catalog from a gear company stuck in Mary Ellen's mailbox, the corner of it curling up as if it was trying to read its own cover. A thin bank of high cloud sitting over the range flat as a table moving east in no hurry. The kind of cloud that doesn't scare you, just makes you pay attention. People think of mountains as the main character in every story you tell about them. I don't. The main character in my stories has always been the clock. You plan in hours, and then if something slips, you plan in minutes. If minutes slip the mountain plans for you. I told that to every group I ever taught, and I meant it in the kindest way. Know your daylight. Know your legs. Know you're out. That week I woke twice in the middle of the night without knowing why. Not from a bad dream or the wind, just awake like somebody said my name from the far end of a hall. The house felt too still. I padded to the kitchen, poured a glass of water, stood at the window, and watched the street. The porch lamps along our block threw careful cones on the gravel. A moth kept tapping the pane like a tiny metronome. The refrigerator kicked on and hummed. I told myself I was being foolish and went back to bed. Friday brought the kind of heat that makes folks lazy. 80-something in town by late afternoon, maybe 50-something if you climbed for an hour and a half. The shuttles were packed again. I fielded 2 calls about folks underestimating the switchbacks, and one about a lost hat that a woman swore had sentimental value. I wrote a note to check the western snowfields for undermined edges after the weekend thaw. I reminded a couple from Ohio that a cotton hoodie is a poor friend when the wind turns knife thin. I closed the office just before 6 and drove home with the sun hanging fat over the mills. The Wyatt's house sat quiet when I pulled in. Their lawn was tidy. A pair of boots sat by the doormat, toes pointed toward the street, drying from a morning's dew. The garage door was down. A raw-cut table leg leaned against the outer wall, pencil marks still visible along its taper. It felt like the whole block took a long breath and let it out. After supper, I took a short walk with my wife the way we do when the heat bleeds off the sidewalk and the night air turns kind. We crossed to the far side of the street so we could wave at Mary Ellen if she was out. She wasn't. The porch light burned soft. A fan pushed lace curtains against the open living room window and back again. Somewhere a screen door clacked and settled. We said hello to the neighbor walking his old shepherd, and the dog leaned into our shins like we were made of something good. Back home, I answered a few emails for the volunteer team, set my radio on the kitchen counter, and stepped out to the back steps with a glass of iced tea. The stars were starting to show, the bright ones first, then the shy ones. The ridge to the east carried a line of gray that didn't belong to any cloud I could name, just a smudge that flattened the horizon and made the peaks look farther away than they ought to at that hour. It put a taste in the air like iron, the way it does before a storm that won't admit it's coming. About 9:30, I checked the radio again out of habit. It murmured the usual logistics fuel levels, shuttle timing, a suggestion to restock maps at Apgar. I could hear a faint hiss under the voices, the kind of low static you get when weather is changing above timberline. I turned the volume down and set it by the window so I could hear if anything real called. I don't sleep heavy when the high country feels restless. Down the block, the Wyatt porch stayed lit. Not bright, not loud, just a steady pool of honey-colored light holding its shape against the driveway. I told myself I liked seeing it there, proof that people I cared about were ending their day the same as I was in the decent quiet a small town promises. As the hour tipped over, I watched that light for one extra minute, then another, waiting for the soft click that would send everyone to bed. The click didn't come. The light held. The street kept its breath. And somewhere past the far black line of the ridge, the wind changed. That porch light stayed on longer than usual that night, its glow sitting low and steady against the gravel drive. I remember glancing through my window, seeing that faint amber pool across the street, and thinking how every family has a rhythm lights that switch off at a certain time, doors that close, routines that keep the world in order. When that rhythm skips, even by a beat, something in you notices. I turned away and told myself Mary Ellen had probably left it on for Luke. Maybe he was still out walking off the heat of the day, the way kids that age sometimes do when they can't shake a thought. I slept uneasy, but I didn't yet know why. By morning, the street looked normal again. The air smelled of rain that hadn't come, and the mountains wore a gray cap of mist. I poured my coffee, stepped onto the porch, and listened. The kind of listening that isn't for sound exactly, but for the feel of the place. The Wyatt's house sat quiet, blinds drawn. Nothing odd about it, but something in the stillness kept its hand on my shoulder. Around 9, I drove into town for a supply-run first aid kits, rope standard issue gear for our weekend hike safety booth. I ran into David near the hardware store, same calm voice, same slow nod. Hello. He mentioned Luke had gone off for a short solo hike east of Glacier, just a couple of days. Nothing big. He said it like you'd mentioned someone running an errand. Luke had done these trips before. Careful Prepared always came back with a small story about a ridge he'd found or a trail that bent differently than the map claimed. I told David the weather might turn come Saturday. He smiled, said Luke's got good instincts. He'll read it better than the forecast. That afternoon, I drove up toward the pass for a short patrol. The roads were clear, but the clouds looked unsettled, high layers, flattening out edges blurred by fast-moving air. That's what we call weather building. You learn to see it before you feel it. By dusk, the sky split open over the high country, thin sheets of rain, 1 minute gone the next, like a pulse. Back in town, the lights came on one by one, just as they always did. I remember seeing the Wyatts' living room glow warm behind those lace curtains, and I figured Luke's trip would be cut a day short once he saw what was coming down from the ridge. 2 days later, Saturday morning, I got the call. Not an emergency call, just Mary Ellen's voice on the house line, gentle but strained. She asked if I'd heard from Luke. I said no, that he'd probably lost signal. She said he'd missed their evening check-in and the hostel he'd planned to stay at hadn't seen him return. She sounded more puzzled than afraid, like she was trying to convince herself it was nothing. I told her to give it till sundown before alerting the sheriff's office. You never want to start a mountain search on a hunch. People run late all the time up there. The mountains don't run on watches. They run on weather. By evening, her voice on the next call was thinner. David had already spoken with the county dispatch, and they agreed to start a limited check at first light. A missing person report in these parts doesn't set off sirens. It starts quiet, cautious. We know how quickly a false alarm can eat up manpower. Still, something about Luke not texting his brother or calling home felt wrong. He was old-fashioned that way, but not careless. He knew the kind of worry that silence can build. Sunday morning came bright and cold, the kind of day that tricks you into thinking it's safe. I met the sheriff's team at the ranger station before dawn. We went over Luke's planned route, a 2-day loop through the lower section of the ridge, starting from a trailhead near the North Fork and circling back through the southern descent. It wasn't the hardest trail, but it demanded respect. Thin ledges, narrow switchbacks, sudden changes in weather. I'd walked parts of it myself over the years, always with company. Solo, it could turn on you. By mid-morning, we were in the air. The helicopter traced the valley blades, cutting the fog into ribbons. From above, the world looked too still. Pine canopies closed tight like green lids hiding anything beneath. The pilot leaned forward, scanning through the haze. I remember the smell of aviation fuel mixing with wet air, the faint taste of iron on my tongue. Over the radio, a ground team reported finding footprints along the trail's early section, fresh, then fading near the ridge. We followed that line as long as we could until wind forced us down. By afternoon, one of the searchers, Mark Jensen, a veteran climber, radioed in that he'd found something. A pack blue nylon sitting upright against a rock near a steep drop. The wind up there is cruel, but the pack hadn't moved an inch. We hiked in from the lower pass, slow and deliberate, testing each step. When we reached the ridge, the world fell silent. No birds, no echo, just wind hissing over ice. The pack was untouched. The zippers were closed, the straps neat. Inside, a folded map, a couple of granola bars, a half-empty bottle of water, and his phone dead but intact. No damage, no scatter, no panic. Everything about it was wrong. People in trouble don't organize their gear. They drop it. I remember kneeling beside it, pressing my hand into the cold rock where it sat, trying to feel if it still held warmth. Nothing. We searched the surrounding area till nightfall, every ledge, every shadowed crevice. The air dropped fast once the sun went. You could feel the chill crawling up from the ground like it meant to take your legs first. We found nothing, no footprints leading away, no marks of a fall, no sign of struggle. Just that pack, deliberate and still, as if he'd placed it there on purpose and walked into the mist. Back at base, we reviewed his trail registry entry. He'd checked in at the first point around 10 in the morning on the day he left. After that, nothing. No other hikers recalled passing him, and no one had seen him at the descent point. It was like he'd vanished in a space of 2 hours on an open trail. I'd seen storms take people before whiteouts that erase footprints in seconds, but something about this didn't match. If he'd fallen, debris or gear should have scattered. If he'd frozen, we'd have found a trace. But the mountain was clean. Too clean. That night I sat with the Wyatts in their kitchen. The house smelled of coffee gone bitter from the burner. Mary Ellen kept rubbing her wedding ring the way people do when they need to keep their hands busy. She asked if I thought he could still be alive. I told her yes, because that's what you say when the alternative would break something you can't fix. David sat silent, staring at the map I'd spread across the table. His finger rested on the trail's midpoint. "Right here," he said, almost to himself. He'd stop here to eat. Always did. He looked up at me. Could a storm move that fast? I said yes. In the Alps, in the Rockies, in any high country weather can roll over a ridge like a wave blue sky to white out in minutes. He nodded, but his eyes were somewhere far away. By day, Hope was thinning. The dogs caught faint scent near the upper switchback, then lost it where the wind tunneled through the pass. We sent climbers down 3 separate ravines. Nothing. The chopper made wider and wider sweeps until fuel and weather called it back. The mountain gave us no noise, no color, no clue. On the 5th morning, as the light came pale and uncertain through the clouds, I stood at the edge of the overlook where the pack had been found. I tried to imagine what he'd seen the valley spilling out below the fog sliding over the ice fields like breath. The kind of view that makes people feel small in a good way until it doesn't. I thought about his quiet nature, how he'd said once at a trail talk that he liked being out there because the world stopped asking questions. I wondered if he'd stepped away chasing that same quiet, not realizing how far it could follow. The search stretched into 10 days. Helicopters grew fewer. Volunteers went home and the radio traffic slowed to silence. The officials called it active search suspended pending new evidence. That's the line they use when a mountain decides to keep what it's taken. I signed off the report, set my gear down, and sat alone in the ranger shack until the generator clicked off for the night. I could still see that blue pack in my mind, bright against gray stone, waiting for a hand that never came back. Weeks passed. The posters went up in town, Luke's face printed under the word missing in bold black letters. The high school held a vigil by the lake. Candles trembled in the evening breeze, their reflections dancing across the water like tiny flares. People spoke softly, promising prayers, telling stories of the boy who'd loved the hills more than the noise of the world. I kept to the backhands deep in my jacket pockets, watching Mary Ellen place a stone on the table with his name carved into it. Not flowers, not balloons, stone. Something that wouldn't blow away. I drove up the valley once more that fall just before the first snow. The trails were empty, the air sharp as glass. Near the ridge, the wind was so cold it stung the inside of my nose. I found the spot again, or close enough to it, though the landmarks had shifted under new rockfall. I stood there a long time, listening to the mountain breathe. It didn't feel cruel. Just ancient patient like it had all the time in the world to decide what to keep and what to give back. When I left that day, I didn't look back. But the next spring, Mary Ellen called me again. Not to ask for news, there hadn't been any, but to tell me she'd started walking part of the trail herself. Just the lower mile, she said, enough to feel near him. I told her I'd meet her there sometime, maybe help her read the terrain. She said softly, "He's still out there, Frank. I know it." And I believed she believed it. Years have a way of smoothing even the sharpest grief into habit. The town went on. David retired early. Jonah moved to Bozeman, started work with a forestry program. But the mountains never forgot. Every so often, someone hiking the ridge would find something small, a scrap of fabric, a buckle, a coin. Nothing conclusive, just whispers of the missing. Each time I'd get a call from the sheriff asking if I could take a look, and each time I drove up thinking maybe this would be it. It never was. Then one summer morning, 7 years to the month after Luke vanished, I got another call. This one wasn't from the sheriff. It came from a climber I'd known for years, his voice thin on the satellite line, wind howling behind him. "Frank," he said, "you might want to come up here. The ice is breaking near the eastern wall. We found something under the melt." His words trembled with awe, not fear. "It looks preserved. I set the phone down and looked out my window at the range, the peaks half hidden in morning haze. After all those years of silence, the mountain had finally decided to speak. I didn't know what it would say, but I knew one thing. When the ice lets go, it doesn't just give back what it took, it gives back everything that's been waiting underneath. And that's where the next part of this story begins. The call came just after sunrise, when the light still carried that soft gold of early summer, and the air outside the window looked clean enough to trust. The climber's voice on the line was ragged thin with altitude, but I knew it right away. Etienne, a French mountaineer who'd been climbing the eastern routes longer than most of us had been alive. He said, "Frank, you'd better come. Something's come up from the ice. You'll want to see this yourself." Then a rush of static swallowed the line. I sat for a long second listening to the hum that replaced his voice, my coffee cooling on the table. I didn't need him to say what he'd found. 7 years of silence from that mountain, and I knew what it meant when the ice decided to give something back. The drive up was slow, the kind that makes you feel like the earth itself is holding its breath. Past the lake, the road wound through stands of cedar and pine, each mile lifting me closer to the snow line. I could feel the temperature drop 10 degrees, maybe 15, and the air took on that metallic bite that tells you the glacier's near. At the base station, 2 local rangers waited, boots crusted with frost eyes drawn to the peaks. One of them, young kid named Ellis, handed me a thermos and said quietly, "They think it's him." That word, think, was doing a lot of work. A chopper took us up the last few miles, blades chopping through the thin air until the valley fell away beneath us like a folded map. From above, the world looked carved from bone, white, endless, unyielding. When we landed, the rotors whipped loose snow into spirals that burned the eyes. The climbers were waiting by a narrow basin roped in and standing still as if they didn't trust what they'd uncovered. One of them pointed toward the meltwater pool beside the rock face. "There," he said, and stepped back. At first I couldn't tell what I was looking at, just a shape under the surface color where there shouldn't be any. Then the light shifted and a sleeve caught the sun, faded blue. Torn but unmistakable. The glacier was shedding pieces of itself like a snake outgrowing its skin, and from that pocket of thaw a body was emerging, curled, still wrapped in time. We moved slow. Every step made the ice groan beneath our boots. Etienne knelt, first gloved hands, brushing away slush, careful as a man handling glass. "We didn't touch him," he said. "We just stopped and called." I crouched beside him, my knees popping from years of rough ground, and looked closer. The jacket, the boots, the patch near the wrist, it was all there. My throat closed around words that wouldn't form. The recovery team arrived by late afternoon. They worked with a patience I'd seen only at funerals, measured, reverent, almost ritual. They cut blocks of ice around the remains, wrapped them in tarps, lifted everything in quiet sequence. No one spoke above a whisper. The wind came and went, the sound of it like slow breathing. When they raised the body, the glacier water shimmered around it, and for a moment it looked as though the mountain itself was letting go. Back at the base, forensic tents had already been pitched. The temperature inside was kept low, the kind of cold that makes you aware of your own pulse. I stayed outside, leaning against a truck fender, watching the clouds burn pink against the ridges. Mary Ellen and David were already on their way up from town. I thought about how they'd feel walking into this silence, how seeing the shape of their son again frozen, preserved but real, would undo the long work of grief they'd spent years surviving. When they arrived that evening, she went first. No hesitation. She just stepped through the tent flap and stood beside the table, her hand hovering over the plastic sheet. She didn't cry, not at first. She just looked, her breath fogging in the cold, and whispered something so soft I couldn't catch it. Then her knees buckled and David caught her under the arms. The sound she made wasn't sharp. It was low, almost gentle, like a prayer that had lost its way. They confirmed what we already knew. Dental records matched. The jacket, the journal, even the compass. Everything pointed back to Luke. The analysts said he'd likely fallen into a shallow crevasse and survived for a time before the cold took him. His body showed no violence, no broken bones, just the curled position of someone trying to stay warm. His pack was close by his supplies, neatly stowed as if he'd been waiting. The notebook was sealed in a waterproof bag, edges stiff from frost. I remember when they unzipped it, the air seemed to change. Pages stuck together, ink bled at the corners, but his handwriting was still there, steady, deliberate. The last entry read, "I'm not lost, just not where people are." Simple, direct, like he'd known this message would be the one to survive. For a while after that, everything blurred into protocol. Reports, interviews, statements for the record. I filled them out mechanically, my pen scratching against the clipboard while my thoughts stayed somewhere else. It wasn't until later that I understood what struck me hardest. He hadn't died running from fear. He'd died in order. There was no sign of panic. He'd rationed his food, melted snow in a plastic bag, logged coordinates in the margins of his map. Every motion spoke of calm persistence, the same quiet discipline I'd seen in him as a boy, folding gauze at that first aid clinic. A few days later, I hiked back to the site alone. The weather had shifted again, clouds sitting lower, their edges feathered by wind. The melt pool had widened a silver mirror rimmed by ice. I stood where we'd first seen him, trying to understand what he'd done in those final hours. He'd climbed beyond his intended route, higher than the maps advised, into terrain that wasn't meant for summer boots or solo travel. It wasn't an accident. He'd gone upward, deliberate as a compass needle pointing north. I couldn't tell if he was chasing something or being called, but either way, he'd gone farther than anyone expected. When the sun broke through for a moment, I saw something I hadn't noticed before, scratches on the granite wall above the recovery site. Not deep, not large, but sharp enough to catch light. I climbed closer, brushing the frost away with my glove. 5 words uneven, carved with effort. I waited. No one came. My chest went hollow. I touched the stone, feeling the cold bite through the leather, and thought of him lying just a few feet below, holding on until the last of his strength gave out. Those words weren't despair. They were record. A final act of clarity, proof that he hadn't given in to confusion. He'd understood exactly what was happening. When I radioed the discovery, the line stayed quiet for a long moment. Then the recovery lead said softly, "We'll document it." Carefully. That was all. No one knew what to say to something like that. Over the next week, word spread through the valley. The papers wrote short, careful pieces. Remains identified in glacier melt. Just facts, no speculation. But in town, the air changed. People lingered longer in the grocery aisles, spoke softer when they passed the Wyatt's driveway. The candles returned to the lake, hundreds this time, floating in a pattern that looked like constellations trying to reform. For the first time in 7 years, Mary Ellen allowed herself to plan a service. When we gathered in the small chapel near the lake, the wind outside carried the smell of pine and thaw. The casket was simple pine wood, no gloss. His journal lay on top, closed, the leather cracked from years of cold. Jonah stood near the front, shoulders squared but eyes red. I'd seen him once before after the disappearance, young, angry, blaming himself for their last argument. Now he just looked tired, the kind of tired that lives under the skin. After the pastor finished, Jonah stepped forward and rested a hand on the box. "He climbed higher than any of us thought he would," he said. "He just didn't come back down." That was all. It was enough. Later that night, when the crowd had gone and the candles had burned to stubs, I walked to the edge of the lake. The surface was still dark as polished stone. I could see the peaks reflected in it, the same ridges that had hidden him for all those years, now softened by distance. I thought about what it meant to love something as dangerous as a mountain, how it can give you peace and take it back in the same breath. The official report listed the cause as hypothermia following an accidental fall. That was the truth in the technical sense. But standing there listening to the wind move through the trees, I knew the story was larger than that. He hadn't been lost. He'd chosen his path with a kind of quiet certainty. Maybe he believed the summit was more than a point on a map, something inward, something beyond what the rest of us can see. A few months later, the seasonal thaw exposed more of the rock wall near where we'd found him. One of the climbers sent me a photograph, faint symbols etched just above the inscription circles overlapping like ripples. The same shapes he'd drawn in his old notebooks, the ones his brother once described as maps to nowhere. Maybe they meant something only he understood, or maybe they were just the last way he knew to mark his place in the world. Either way, I printed the photo and pinned it on the wall of my study. Not as evidence, just as remembrance. I still go up there once a year when the snow recedes enough to make the path passable. The glacier's smaller now, its edges bleeding away with each summer. Nature doesn't keep secrets forever. It just waits for the right season to let them breathe. Each time I climb, I look for the mark on that rock face. The ice covers it most years, but sometimes the sunlight hits just right and I can see the carving glint for an instant before the shadow returns. It reminds me that silence isn't always absence. It can be its own kind of voice. As I start the descent each year, I glance back over my shoulder one last time. The wind moves through the pines, low and steady, carrying a sound that might be the mountain sighing, or might just be my own breath echoing back. Either way, I listen. Because somewhere up there in that thin air, where even sound feels fragile, the truth of what happened to Luke Wyatt still lingers, half mystery, half memory, and it hasn't finished telling its story yet. The day after the service, the weather turned brittle again. Sharp wind, hard light, the kind that drains color out of everything it touches. I drove out to the ranger station to sign the last of the paperwork. The glacier was closing for the season. That meant checklists, storage, final reports. Routine is a comfort when you've spent too much time in silence. But even as I worked through the motions, radio logs, fuel notes, gear returns, my mind stayed fixed on that ridge where we'd found him and on those words carved into the rock. I waited. No one came. They'd taken on a weight of their own. People around town spoke of them like scripture, quoting them in whispers, not out of morbid interest, but out of respect. In small communities, grief becomes folklore, whether you want it to or not. 2 weeks later, one of the forensics techs from Helena called. He was quiet for a while before saying what he needed to say. "We found something else in the pack," he told me. Hidden pocket double stitched inside the lining. My stomach went cold before he even described it. A small camera, cracked, weathered, but still intact enough to read. They'd extracted one partial file, a single image. I asked what was on it. He said, "You'll want to see it for yourself." I made the drive that same afternoon. The lab sat on the outskirts of town concrete walls, fluorescent hum, that smell of solvents that never leaves your clothes. The technician led me to a small monitor and clicked the file open. It wasn't a video. Just a photograph, time-stamped July 14th, 2016, late afternoon. Luke stood on a ridge of ice, his hood-down sun cutting through the clouds behind him. The light turned the air around him to gold. His cheeks were raw, but he was smiling, an honest, small smile, the kind you don't fake for a camera. He looked steady, peaceful. There was no fear in that face, just acceptance. I remember the tech saying something about lens distortion or data corruption, but I wasn't listening. I kept staring at that picture, the horizon stretching behind him like a frozen ocean. He looked like he belonged there. When I brought the photo to the Wyatts, I expected it to undo them. It didn't. Mary Ellen stared at it for a long time, tracing her finger along the outline of his face. He wasn't afraid, she whispered. I always knew that. David nodded but didn't speak. He just rested his hand on the back of her chair and kept looking. It was Jonah who finally asked the question we were all thinking. Was that right before he... I told him we couldn't know. Maybe hours before, maybe minutes. What mattered was the stillness in it. Jonah studied it a while, then said, "He looks like he found what he was chasing." In the following days, more pieces surfaced. The final entries from his notebook, carefully preserved and now legible after thawing, were examined. They weren't frantic or confused. They were calm, reflective. One line stood out to me. "I'm not escaping. I'm arriving." I didn't tell the family that at first. It felt private, like something meant to stay between him and the mountain. But it lived in my mind the way a tune plays long after the radio's been turned off. The investigation shifted from rescue to reconstruction, mapping his route, calculating distances, trying to understand how he'd reached that impossible ridge. He'd climbed nearly 3.5 kilometers beyond his last known position. No rope, no spikes, no partner. Just determination and timing that defied reason. The slope he ascended was considered unapproachable without technical gear, yet he'd crossed it. We traced boot impressions frozen in the ice where the melt had refrozen over time. Each print was deliberate, angled, efficient. He'd known what he was doing. The coroner's final report came back at the end of the month. Hypothermia secondary, trauma to the ankle, fractured but not shattered. They said he'd fallen partway, maybe 20 feet, twisted his leg, and still managed to crawl another 200 yards uphill before stopping. The idea of that haunted me. I pictured him dragging himself across that glacial slope, the wind howling, the cold burrowing deeper by the minute, and yet still climbing. Still believing he could reach something. When you work in search and rescue, you learn the difference between panic and persistence. Panic leaves chaos behind. Persistence leaves order. Luke left order. The handwriting on that rock proved it. The forensic report noted pressure marks deep enough to suggest he'd carved the words with force despite freezing hands. The chisel or knife used wasn't found. He must have carried it till the end, maybe dropped it into the crevasse as he faded. Those words, I realized, weren't written to accuse anyone. They were a record of time, a way to measure the waiting. Around then, rumors began to ripple online. Someone on a hiking forum posted about the discovery, added speculation about hidden passages and secret cults in the Alps. Within days, the thread had spun into wild theories. He was taken. He staged his own disappearance. He followed something ancient. I'd seen it before, how mystery breeds invention when the truth feels too quiet. The Wyatts ignored it, but Jonah didn't. He called me one night, voice tight. "They're turning him into a ghost story," he said. "He was real, Frank. He was my brother." I told him people chase stories because they're easier than silence. He let out a breath that sounded like surrender. By late summer, the glacier changed again. The melt line receded further, uncovering parts of the ridge we hadn't seen in decades. A team went back to resurvey the area, and I joined them. The weather was merciful, clear sky, steady wind, the kind of day that tricks you into thinking the mountains have forgiven you. As we moved along the ridge, I noticed something strange about the rock face near where Luke had been found. There were more carvings, faint, almost erased by time. Circles, overlapping lines running through them like constellations. At first I thought they were natural abrasions. Then I recognized them. I'd seen those same patterns sketched in the notebooks we'd recovered from his room all those years ago. He'd drawn them in margins on the backs of maps, as if they meant something only he could decode. Now, here they were, etched into the mountain itself. We documented everything, took photos, measurements, samples. But deep down, I knew science wouldn't explain it. Whatever Luke had followed up there wasn't madness. It was intent. The symbols, the climb, the writing all spoke of purpose. He wasn't trying to die. He was trying to reach. When we got back down, I stayed behind at the overlook, letting the others hike ahead. The valley below looked softer from that height, almost forgiving. I could see the line where snow gave way to stone, the river cutting a silver thread through the forest miles below. I thought about Mary Ellen walking that same lower trail every July, retracing his steps. I thought about the patience it must take to love someone you can't bring home. The wind picked up colder now, brushing past my ear like a whisper. I don't believe in signs, but for a moment I turned and thought I saw movement on the ridge, a shimmer, maybe a trick of light, like a figure walking into the mist. I blinked, and it was gone. That night, I wrote my own report, the unofficial kind I keep in a drawer separate from the rest. I described the carvings, the ridge, the feeling that the mountain had been trying to speak all along. I ended it with a single line. Some people don't get lost. They just go where maps stop speaking. I didn't show it to anyone. Some truths don't fit in official language. Weeks passed. The world moved on. The glacier began its long freeze again. The Wyatts finally laid Luke's belongings to rest: his compass, his journal, a folded map. Mary Ellen told me she still couldn't bring herself to read the last pages. "Not yet," she said. "Maybe someday." David stood beside her, one hand resting on her shoulder, eyes fixed on the distant ridge. I think he understood that grief doesn't always end in answers. Sometimes it just folds itself into routine until you can carry it. On the drive home, I stopped at the overlook one last time before winter closed the road. The air was clean and thin, the sky painted in slow-moving clouds. Down below, the trail shimmered faintly under a dusting of early snow. I reached into my jacket and pulled out the photograph of Luke, the one from the camera. The paper had already begun to curl at the edges. I set it on the stone ledge beside me, anchoring it with a small rock. "You found it," I said quietly, though I wasn't sure what it meant anymore. As I turned to leave, a gust of wind lifted the edge of the photo. It fluttered once, twice, and slid off into the canyon, caught in the current like a falling leaf. I watched it spiral downward until it disappeared into the distance. For a moment, I felt something shift, not closure exactly, but peace shaped like it. Maybe it was the mountain exhaling, or maybe it was just me finally letting go. But as I reached the truck, I caught one last sound, the faint scrape of rock against ice carried on the wind. I turned, scanning the ridge. Nothing there, just shadow and distance. Still, I stood for a long time listening. The sound came again, softer this time, almost like the echo of someone carving into stone. Then the wind stilled, and the mountain went quiet once more. I drove down with the heater off, letting the cold fill the cab. It felt right, somehow, to hear the road beneath the tires, to feel the silence following behind me. Because somewhere up there, under new snow and old memory, the mountain was keeping its promise. It had spoken once, and I knew it would speak again. And when it did, I'd be listening. Winter came early that year, hard and quiet. The kind of cold that doesn't ask permission, just slips down from the high country and stays. By December, the pass was buried again, the road gated off, and the ridge where Luke had been found disappeared beneath a new sheet of ice. From the valley, you couldn't even see the stone where he'd carved his words. The mountain had folded itself back into silence, as if the whole thing had never happened. But we remembered. Everyone in town did. Mary Ellen still walked the lower trail every Sunday morning, no matter the weather. She'd start before dawn, flashlight in hand, bundled in the same coat she'd worn that first week of the search. She never said much about what she felt up there. Some people grieve out loud. Others do it through motion. I think for her, walking was the only way to keep time moving without letting the past fade completely. David joined her when he could, but mostly he stayed home, keeping the porch light on until she returned. That light burned softer now, still a beacon, but no longer a waiting signal. Just a reminder that love can keep its shape even after loss changes everything around it. Jonah moved back that spring. He'd left Bozeman quietly after his forestry contract ended, came home with the same pickup and a quieter spirit. One evening he stopped by my place with a box of his brother's things, Maps, sketches, the journals we hadn't opened. "Mom says she's ready," he told me. So we sat at my kitchen table. 3 of us, the smell of wood smoke in the air, and went through the pages one at a time. The handwriting stayed steady till the very end. Notes about weather, wind direction, sunrise times. Then, halfway through the last notebook, the tone shifted. The entries turned almost meditative. One line read, "The silence isn't empty. It's full of things waiting to be heard." Another, "If I don't make it back, tell them I wasn't afraid." Mary Ellen read those words aloud, her voice thin but sure. Then she closed the notebook and pressed her palms flat on the cover. "He found peace out there," she said. "It just came too high up." David didn't speak, but I could see his jaw working. Some pain doesn't need words. It just lives under the surface, changing how a person breathes. Over the next few months, the story drifted beyond our valley. A national magazine ran a short piece about the discovery, called it "The Glacier That Kept a Secret." They got most of the details right, though they left out what mattered most, the quiet decency of the boy behind it all. Folks love a mystery more than they love the truth, and the truth in this case wasn't cinematic. It was simple. A young man went searching for stillness, and the world in its cruel way gave him too much of it. Every year after that, new hikers came through asking where it happened. Some just wanted to see the trail. Others wanted to feel something, whatever it was, that Luke might have felt up there. The rangers put up a small marker by the lower overlook, in memory of those who climb beyond fear. No name, no date, just that line. It was enough. As for me, I stayed with search and rescue another couple of years before retiring for good. The work was getting harder, the knees, the cold, the endless paperwork that came with every new disappearance. But Luke's case never left me. Sometimes late at night I'd dream of that blue pack sitting upright on the ridge waiting like an open hand. I'd wake before dawn and walk out back where the mountains were still visible in silhouette. You can't work this long around loss without carrying pieces of it inside you. But I've learned that carrying isn't the same as being crushed. It's just how memory keeps its balance. In 2022, Mary Ellen asked me to help her start something, a small fund for missing hikers and their families. Nothing grand, just enough to help with helicopter fuel dog teams, hot meals for the volunteers who go out when everyone else is going in. She called it Echoes of the Lost, said it was for Luke and for all the others who never made it home. The first year, the fund helped locate a stranded climber near the North Fork. The pilot told me later that when they found him, the man kept saying, "I thought no one was coming." I didn't tell him why that phrase hit me the way it did. By then, the Wyatts had rebuilt a kind of life. Not the same, never the same, but steady. Jonah took over his father's workshop, started crafting small wooden keepsakes, simple crosses, walking sticks, carved maps. He made one for me, a smooth cedar staff with a tiny brass compass embedded at the top. "For when you head up there again," he said. "I still keep it by the door. I've gone back to the ridge every summer since. The first time I went alone. The climb's harder now. Age makes every step a negotiation. But I needed to see it to know that it was still there, that the mountain hadn't erased everything. The glacier had pulled back farther, revealing new stone, new scars in the earth. And there, half covered by frost, were Luke's words. Weathered, fainter, but still legible. I waited. No one came. Only now I read them differently. Back then they sounded like sorrow. Now they sound like patience, like he was holding space until we were ready to find him. The air up there has its own kind of quiet, not the kind that's empty, but the kind that feels aware of you. The wind moves differently around that rock, almost softer, as if even the mountain learned something from him. I always stand there a while, say nothing, then place a small stone at the base before I leave. Some folks pray. I stack rocks. It's the same language, just quieter. This past summer, Mary Ellen joined me for the first time. She's older now, slower on her feet, but stubborn as ever. We took our time up the switchbacks, resting when the wind cut sharp across the slope. When we finally reached the overlook, she just stood there, hands on her knees, breathing hard but smiling. "It's beautiful," she said, almost surprised. I nodded. "He always said it was," I told her. She stepped forward, laid a small piece of folded paper under a stone, and didn't say what it was. I didn't ask. Some offerings aren't meant to be opened. On the way down, the sky changed clouds moving in from the west, the kind that mean weather's coming. We took shelter near the old shelter post, shared a thermos of coffee, and watched the world close in. She looked out toward the ridge and said, "I don't think he's gone, Frank." "Not really." I said I knew. And I did. Because in every echo of wind, in every trickle of meltwater running down that stone, there's a sense that something remains, something watching, not haunting, just present. Back home, I keep one of Luke's maps framed in my study. The edges are torn, the pencil lines faded, but it shows the ridge as he drew it before his last climb. In the corner, he'd written a single word: stillness. Not a goal, a direction. Maybe that's all he ever wanted, to find a place where the noise of the world couldn't reach him, and maybe in the cruelest kind of grace he did. I've told this story many times over the years to students, to rangers in training, to families still waiting for their own calls, but I never tell it the same way twice. It changes depending on what I need to remember that day. Sometimes it's about patience. Sometimes it's about letting go. And sometimes it's just about a boy who walked farther than anyone expected and taught the rest of us how far the heart can travel before it rests. When people ask if I believe the mountain meant to take him, I tell them no. Mountains don't take. They keep. They hold on to what we leave behind until the world is ready to understand it. That's their mercy and their cruelty. As I finish this recording, I can hear the wind outside moving down from the high peaks. It sounds like breathing. The same sound I heard the day we found him. The same sound that's been part of every silence since. Some stories never really end, they just settle into the land waiting for someone to listen long enough to hear them again. If this story stayed with you, share it not for views, but so no one's name gets lost to the dark. Because every once in a while the mountains give something back, and when they do, it's our job to remember who they return.